Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started now. I'm Pam Lopress, Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all here. Thank you all for coming. This is our second event in our series on building community colleges for the future, focusing today on developing short-term credentials of value. I also want to welcome our virtual audience. This is being webcast live stream. Also, you'll be able to watch this presentation and our previous event online at urban.org. Today's conversation should go beyond this room, so I encourage everyone in the audience here and watching over the web to share your thoughts or observations on social media. We're using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, live@urban, and please include the speaker's Twitter handles, which are on your agenda today. So I'd like to start by thanking JPMorgan Chase for their support for this convening and for our whole body of work that we've been doing on system change strategies for community colleges. Urban and JPMorgan Chase have been working together since 2014 to leverage data and evidence to support programs that increase economic opportunity and strengthen communities. So I've been working on this body of work since the beginning of our collaboration with JPMorgan Chase, and it's been really great to see how our partnership has built actionable evidence and provided a lot of information to inform policy and practice in a variety of areas in workforce. This has really been helped by JPMorgan's workforce expertise and their portfolio of grantees that they have been funding under their New Skills at Work philanthropic investments. Today, we're thrilled to have a panel of experts who are going to talk and discuss about developing short-term credentials in the labor market. We know from our work and from other work that community colleges are playing a key role in providing economic opportunity for many. And the data shows that additional education and training beyond high school is really essential for people to be able to make it in this labor market. So it's important to really understand community colleges' role and help support community colleges to be successful. For some, we know, accessing and completing education training is difficult for reasons such as family responsibilities, having to work as well, and maybe just lack of prior success in academic settings. And so we need to think about how to help target opportunities for these individuals. And short-term credentials really fits into that, and we'll hear more, I think, today about how that might work and how that has a potential to help those students, but also employers. So today, I'd like to, before we dive into the first panel, introduce Faith Leach, who is the Chief of Staff at JPMorgan Chase and Company Foundation. She spent the last decade working to address key drivers of economic inequality experienced by vulnerable populations in cities across the country. Prior to joining JPMorgan, Faith served as the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Mayor for Greater Economic Opportunity under DC Mayor Muriel Bowser here in DC, where she provided strategic oversight and direction to a cluster of government agencies focused on connecting residents in overlooked and underserved neighborhoods with jobs and skill training, growing local entrepreneurs, and promoting equitable, community-centered economic development in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. Her experience also includes work in the City of Durham, Office of Economic Development, Mecklenburg County Government in Charlotte, North Carolina General Assembly House of Representatives, and selection as Leadership and Policy Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Faith will talk more about JPMorgan Chase's efforts in this space, the New Skills at Work, but before I turn the microphone over to her, I just want to take a moment to reflect on the tremendous impact that their philanthropic leadership in general in the workforce development field has had. Their current New Skills at Work initiative is a 5-year, $350 million global initiative to prepare for the future of work. And it builds on their original 5-year, $250 million commitment in 2013. So let's take a moment to recognize the great effort and give Faith a warm welcome. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We are so very grateful for Urban Institute's thought leadership and partnership, and for this exciting series focused on strengthening community colleges. As Pam mentioned, I have the immense pleasure of working with the president of the JPMorgan Chase Foundation as Chief of Staff to Janice Bowdler on our global initiatives promoting inclusive development and economic growth around the world. 6 years ago, our leadership at JPMorgan set out on a bold vision for corporate responsibility. We wanted to explore how we could leverage the full resources of our firm to drive inclusive growth in our communities across the globe, from historic Anacostia all the way to neighborhoods in East London. We began by focusing our efforts on 4 key drivers of economic opportunity: starting and revitalizing small businesses, revitalizing neighborhoods, promoting financial health, and building skills for a 21st century job market, which we're going to talk a little bit more about today. We announced our first of these initiatives, New Skills at Work, in 2013, committing to $250 million for 5 years to help students, workers, and job seekers develop the skills they need for in-demand careers. Over the course of that effort, we supported more than 700 nonprofits in 80 U.S. cities and 35 countries. Collectively, these outstanding organizations strengthened key education and workforce systems and served nearly 150,000 job seekers around the world. Doubling down on this success, JPMorgan Chase & Co. announced our expanded $350 million 5-year global initiative this March, focused on preparing individuals and communities for the future of work and meeting the growing demand for skilled workers. A key focus of this initiative is a $125 million commitment to strengthening key education providers, including community colleges. Enrolling more than 6.7 million students annually, community colleges are the largest workforce training providers in most communities. Yet despite this tremendous scale, too few students are graduating with valuable skills and credentials and are failing to secure good-paying jobs that are promised after college. A critical solution that is being discussed today is how community colleges can offer short-term programs to train people with the most essential skills needed to secure a good job. As our chairman and CEO, Jamie Dimon, says, the new world of work is about skills, not necessarily degrees. Short-term credentials exemplify this idea by stripping away unnecessary coursework and focusing in on the skills that matter the most. We are thankful to Urban for your leadership on this issue. Each is a leader in pushing to ensure the degrees meet the needs of their students and are aligned with the in-demand skills of the region. Our hope is that other community colleges, education providers, nonprofits, and funders learn from these examples. Nationally, JPMorgan Chase is taking a comprehensive approach to building the capacity of community colleges and enhancing their ability to prepare students for in-demand skills and drive economic mobility. In partnership with the Aspen Institute's College Excellence Program, we are supporting the development of diverse, new, and aspiring community college presidents. And in several markets, we are making targeted investments into local community college systems. Community colleges around the country are incubating exciting new models and programs that will prepare millions of students for upward career mobility. We're excited to be spotlighting some of these efforts this afternoon and to be advancing the conversation on how we can create valuable credentials for students to succeed in our rapidly changing economy. Thank you so much, and I want to bring up our first panel.
Thanks to all of you for being here today. It's great to see so many of you joining us for lunch, and also for those of you who are joining us online. I'm Dimitri Nightingale, and I'm an Institute Fellow here at the Urban Institute. Much of my research is on job training, employment, social policy, income, and careers. So this panel and the great panelists that we have today are really enriching some of the discussions around the research that we do and highlighting some of the practices that seem to be emerging and represent some of the leading kinds of approaches that community colleges are using. And of course, we have our research perspective on this end. So probably about 15 years ago, my students, when I was teaching at Johns Hopkins University, my students suddenly started asking for credentials. And so we, in response to the demand from our students, developed credential programs that paralleled some of the degree programs that were happening. And since then, now I'm teaching at George Washington University, students are still asking for credentials, usually short-term credentials that complement but don't duplicate some of the degree activity. So it's not only at community colleges, but even at the four-year colleges that short-term credentials are increasingly important and demanded by students as well as by the labor market. So we're anxious to get right into it and to hear about some of the strategies these institutions are using. You have bios for all of the speakers, but I just want to briefly introduce them to you. Christina Amato is the Dean of E-Learning at Sinclair College in Dayton, Ohio. And so that will be certainly an interesting approach using the technology. Kyle Dalpy is Vice President for Instruction at Western Nevada College in Carson City, and brings a different perspective and a different geographic focus. Moving to sort of an organizational level, Heidi Spies is with NOCTI, an organization that provides schools and industries with credentials and assessment tools. And here on my left is my good colleague Harry Holzer from Georgetown University, the McCourt School of Public Policy, who has done many studies on job training and career development. So with that, I just want to begin to ask a few questions, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions from all of you in the room. I'll start with Harry. And certainly Harry's extensive research has examined the value of credentials, including short-term credentials for workers who are in the labor market, and the role of community colleges. So why would you say that short-term credentials are important? What does it mean for the credentials to be of value in the labor market, and what role do they play for workers?
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be here on this panel. Thank you for including me. The question of why it's important for workers, actually Pam said it very well at the outset. There's simply a lot of workers who could benefit from some kind of training, some kind of skill enhancement, who can't make the commitment to something full-time or longer term. So this is a nice option for them to be able to improve their skills. There's other reasons that employers like them, and then we'll come back to that later. And it's also, some adults also don't want, or perhaps aren't academically prepared for something more rigorous, more academic, and having short-term, more bite-sized credentials that teach them specific tasks, specific skills could be very useful for them. But then the follow-up question is very important. Do these credentials have value? And the truth is some do in the labor market and some don't. And by the way, these credentials come in many shapes and sizes. If you define short-term as, say, 6 months or less, credentials can be 6 months, they could be 4 weeks. On average, longer term gives people more of an earnings bump. They could be for academic credit, or they could be not for academic credit. Having some credits also on average enhances, but even shorter term non-credit can have labor market value. And how should we think about that labor market value? The way economists think about this, for better or worse, is what would a person's earnings be on average with the credential compared to what they would get without that credential. And of course, you need data on the person before and after, and on other people who didn't get the credential, who otherwise are very similar. And this is a really important point, because I often hear people in the Washington, D.C. community, some of my more left-wing friends who say, oh, but that credential is no good because it pays so little. Say, certified nurse assistant, on average, might make, I don't know, $15,000 a year in some places. That's not worth investing in. It's a really incorrect way to think about it. The question is, how does that $15,000 compare to what that same person would have made without it? If they were earning only $10,000 without it, that short-term credential has value. You might call it value added above and beyond what they would have absent that credential. So I think that's the right way to think about these, that the value, it's value added to the person that enables them to go beyond the very entry-level work and entry-level earnings that many people have absent the credential.
So it's really then sort of a step toward improving opportunity in the future. And I wanted to just shift and take that to the college perspective. Christina and Kyle, you're leaders in developing short-term credentials, and they have value in the communities that you're serving. Can you give us an overview of what your institutions are doing to develop those credentials, and how do you know if they have value to the students or to the employers? We'll start with Christina.
Sure. So I think how we've engaged this conversation has changed pretty dramatically over the years, and a lot of that in my community was driven by the economic downturn in 2008. To provide a good example, in 2012, my college proposed one of the largest grant projects we would ever participate in, a Round 2 TAC grant. And as part of that grant, we had to submit that proposal with the support of 3 major employers in our region that we would work with to develop those credentials, train up students, and get them into more advanced positions within their employers. Within short order of receiving that grant, one of our 3 employers declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy and shuttered in Dayton and left the area. And I think that was reflective of something larger that was happening in our region. We lost Delphi as a major employer. That was 10,000 employees in our region. And formerly, we used to engage the work of advisory boards with a handful of these large employers, and we would create pipelines by which thousands of students would be going into a handful of small employers. And what we're seeing today is the exact inverse of that. We have hundreds of small and regional employers that are taking handfuls of our students out of individual programs. So that's required a change away from our traditional advisory board model, in which we meet quarterly and we discuss curriculum and we update curriculum. It's much different and more broad now. So we've had to lean into different sources to help us build, enrich, and vet curriculum. That includes our state. Our state often sets some sort of standards. IT is a good example. We have state standards in Ohio that we can help build out our curriculum by. We also relied on our county job agencies and workforce agencies, and we rely on regional trade associations that can kind of wrap their arms around these larger groups of employers than we might effectively do as a single institution. And they gauge them and ask them not just what are your needs today, but what do you think your needs are 1 year from now and 3 years from now. And so we bring in these various sources of information and synthesize them, and then again bring them back to employers and ask them, does this curriculum work for you? What are you seeing at the ground level, and how could we improve what we're providing to students? So I think it's a different game for us than it was 10 years ago, and we've really had to adapt how we have those conversations.
So in terms of responding to sort of the needs in the community and changing over time, Kyle, can you give us a sense of how your school has developed the short-term credentials and how you know they're of value and how they relate to labor market issues?
Sure, and thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here. In the state of Nevada, in the last 8 to 10 years, we've been dealing with a diversification of the economy, and so the employers that have been attracted to the state have been brought there kind of under the economic development authorities and the state economic development plan. And when they come in and move into the state to diversify us from a gaming and tourism economy into a lot of advanced manufacturing, a lot of electronics, a lot of computer-related industries, we meet with those employers before they come, but also once they've established to provide that trained workforce. And the value of the credential has to be of value to the employers that will hire the students. And so we would never create a credential that we thought was just right without meeting, similar to what Christina said about the advisory boards, or meeting with the industries and having them in and saying, what kind of workforce are you looking for and what are you training? And we have some big players in our state. We have a Tesla Gigafactory, we have a Panasonic battery production, and a lot of other small manufacturers that I didn't even know they were there, having spent almost 20 years in the state, and they just pop up and say, we need people. And so the value to the student is, similar to what was said by Harry first, was that like a CNA student, for example, that's a credential that helps with employment because it keeps the person employed. It's very valuable. The wages may not be high, but there's two benefits. One is that it usually comes with health benefits. It's also more recession-proof, and it is a stepping stone into the profession of nursing. So CNA will progress into registered nursing and so on, and so it helps the student that way. So we develop credentials that employers kind of demand, and we review it with them, and we talk to them about it, and we tweak it along the road, and then the students progress through the pathways. And one of the things we've done, having done this at the community college level for years, is we always build short-term credentials that are maybe under 30 credits that stack into a 30-credit certificate, that stack into an associate degree at 60 credits, and then that 60 credit, we even offer one bachelor's degree, and we're looking to expand more. That 60 will stack into 120 credits. So when the student does that whole run based on their need, they haven't taken extra classes. Every one of them counts for the next step up. So that's kind of how we work on the discussion and how we keep it going.
And certainly the role of the certificates themselves, the credentialing tools, and the utility for both employers and for the training institutions is critical. So Heidi, NOCTI plays a really important role as a third-party developer of the certifications and assessments that community colleges are using in programs around the country. Can you tell us more about what it is that NOCTI's work and the role of third-party certification provides to the community college systems?
Sure. Thanks again for inviting us. This is a timely conversation for our organization as well. Several of our partners are engaging with their partners on the topic of short-term credentials, really hearing from their communities that there's a need to quickly move people through the education pipeline so that they can enter the workspace. And so we're working with them to determine what that looks like. We have one partner, the Manufacturing Skills Standards Council, that has an overall certification, one in logistics and one in production. But underneath that overall certification are 4 different shorter certifications. And so that allows individuals to earn 1 or 2, depending on what their situation is. But again, being able to stack those to earn the overall certification whenever it fits their particular needs or the needs of their employers. We have another organization in Washington that connects community colleges and industry, trying to determine what those needs are in their community. And recently, they had an employer come to them and say that they needed 200 welders for a particular type of welding in the next 2 years. And so what does that look like for their local community college that had a 1-year program and a 2-year program? And certainly you're not going to be able to turn out 200 workers in 2 years. So they worked together to create a 10-week program to start, really just to start funneling those individuals through and credentialing them at that point. And to your point, all of that work stacks into that 1-year or that 2-year program. And so we're really working with those partners to determine what those needs are, what the credentials should look like to make sure that they're relevant and of a quality, standards and competencies. And we've seen a lot of change over the years too. NOCTI's been around for over 50 years, and our initial purpose was credentialing individuals coming from industry into CTE world to be teachers way back in the 60s. So, I mean, the change over just that whole 50-year history and really in the last 10 years has been really interesting. And so I was really looking forward to this conversation.
This is great, and it sort of brings us back a little bit to the employer roles in developing or partnering to develop the short-term credentials. And certainly working with employers is important, but what it is that the employers are doing in this regard is important. So Kyle, how have you gotten employers interested in this work, and what are the ways that you connect with employers or industry around developing the new credentials?
Yeah, so the key way to get employers in the room is still around lunchtime pizza parties in the city. And that is one of those where.
Yeah,
you know,
we
you
like
can-
lunchtime
yeah,
efforts as
exactly.
well.
So I had had a major employer walk into my office and say, in 1 year, similar situation, different numbers. In 1 year, we need 2,000 people trained for advanced manufacturing. And I said, wow, I've got 75 in the pipeline. So what we did was we have to get them to the table, so literally getting them to the table. And there's two parts of this. There's the advisory groups where you put a sector in all the advanced manufacturers or all the welders or all the builders in a room. And they'll all talk, but they won't talk 100% because they're watching out for their own interests. And then there's one-on-ones. And as I was a vice president of instruction, and previously I was a dean of technical sciences at my former institution, I would have those confidential conversations where we'd say, okay, tell me what you need. I'm not going to share it. I'm putting it all into the aggregate list, and then we'll see what all the different players say individually. And then meet with them one-on-one, and then you can kind of distill out what they need for a certificate, and then put it back in front of them, and they'll either be, wow, this is exactly what we need, or not. They'll say, we need this, not that. One of the things we've used on the one-on-one meetings is, first of all, have it with the employers, have it with their key people, bring in faculty, but you have to have their HR people, because those are the ones that are making the job descriptions. And they look at the skill sets that are recommended, and we've actually laid out curriculum down to the objective level and said, this class is whatever it is, Applied Tech 101 or whatever, and it has 6 objectives, and they're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've laid it out on the table and said, or put it up on the screen and said, which competencies do you need? And they can pick and choose. They'll say, well, we need 1, but we don't need 2, we need 3. And then we can build the curriculum or modify it based on that and put together a special package of classes. I don't like to dissect too much individual classes, but we can definitely take a 2-year degree program that has a number of classes and say, these 5 at 3 credits each become a skill certificate of 15 credits total for you, for this employer. The employers vet it, and every time we do a skill certificate, it has to lead to an industry-recognized credential in order for us to count it in our completion numbers. So that's an incentive for us to match that piece of it and help employers match that.
And Christina, how do you connect with employers, and is it similar or different from what Kyle was talking about? And you also mentioned earlier sort of the effect of the downturn in the economy and the recession, and how do you see sort of the role of employers over the course of the labor market?
So I also find it true that feeding people helps get them into a room. In Nevada, they eat lunch. In Ohio, we eat breakfast. So our employers like breakfast meetings. And what we've had to do, just kind of based on my previous commentary about what's happening to our employer base in the region, is we've had to diversify what those groups look like. So if you put HR people in a room, they will help you tinker with job descriptions and tell you how that looks. That's one component of a much broader effort to understand curriculum. And so we have what we call C-level meetings, where we attempt to get in CEOs, CIOs, those senior executive leaders, and we push harder on them, not just about immediate job forecast needs, but again, what might you need 1 year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? How do you see this field evolving? And we also pull in individual line workers, operators, ask them about their jobs, and we kind of integrate all of that feedback into a process to then, again, similar to Kyle's model, to bring it back to the employers and say, does this fit what you have in mind? And we will do the same thing, go down to the detail level. To provide a good example of how this works, several years ago, we heard overwhelmingly from our broad base of IT employers in the region that they were struggling with getting a baseline skill level out of IT graduates where they could guarantee that they had certain foundational elements in terms of their skill level. So we went back to the drawing board, looked at all 20 plus of our IT programs, which included short-term certificates, degrees, various different iterations of that, and found that all of those programs had 6 courses in common that provided the foundation for all IT programs, regardless of where those students were going. And we built an IT fundamentals certificate based on that, that would essentially provide the message to students, start here, go anywhere in IT, but also to employers, we're providing those basic level skills that you've indicated that you need. And then we collect feedback loops through various things like internships, apprenticeships, and kind of pull back the data that we get from them. Is this working? Does this meet the need that they've indicated to us?
That's great, and both Kyle and Christina gave us some examples of how they engage with employers and how employers have been involved. I'm turning to Harry now to see what do we know about the importance of short-term certificates for employers hiring, and do we have research on that that coincides with what they talked about, or is it a different pattern?
I think most people, both in the policy world and the research world these days, believe that it's very important that when you're training somebody that it has some relationship to the employer, right? You know, for a long time, we would train people completely independently of what employers were demanding on the skill side, and we know this is a much better, and there's a lot of research saying that paying attention to employer needs is a good thing. And I think the research bears that out. Now, there are some specific models of doing this that are better than others, I think, in a lot of ways. So one is what people call sector-based job training, where more broadly than this one task or this one skill need, you have an intermediary who knows the industry well. The intermediary often brings together not only the employers and the training providers, but also the students and workers. And if the students need particular supports to take advantage of this, and the intermediaries might have a slightly broader perspective of what the students need, so sector-based training in the research generates, at its best, quite large impacts on earnings. And of course, another model is apprenticeship. I figure Bob Lerman's here, so I got to get that in somewhere in the conversation. But you know, apprenticeships, a lot more of the training is actually on the job, but many apprenticeships these days do also work hand in hand with community colleges. And I think that's a very good thing, because there's a little bit of a tension in these matters. There's some tension between short-term versus long-term needs of the workers and very narrow versus somewhat broader skill provision. And I'm really glad when Christina said, they ask what are you going to need in 3 years or 5 years, that starts to combat this really short-term focus. That's the risk, that if you focus very, very heavily on what employers need today, and you train only to that need, what they need today might be really different than what they need a few years down the road. In a world of heavy automation, for instance, you know, some of those tasks will be automatable, and all of a sudden the skill in which these workers are investing may not be as high demand as it was before. So I think involving the community college, involving intermediaries, you get a slightly wider perspective. I also think, you know, and by the way, there's a whole other range of short-term credentials out there, outside of the community college community. You know, people call them industry-recognized credentials. Some people refer to this as the Wild West of credentials. So many, this plethora of you know, badges and microcredentials, and frankly, we don't always know which of those have value. The employers don't know, the workers don't know, we as researchers don't know. But in some sense, I think the advantage of doing this within a community college framework is that you can make it at least a little bit broader, and you can have some thinking about, okay, 5 years down the road, 10 years, and of course, as Kyle said, you know, there's the advantage that you can build on these credentials and maybe try to stack them to a bigger credential, but also in that context, just making sure that the worker has a piece of paper that may be of value beyond just the specific employer who's asking for it right now.
Mm-hmm. So Harry has raised some critical issues in terms of the importance for adapting to the labor market needs, so that the credentials of the short-term training programs of today may not be necessarily the ones that will be needed a few years from now. So there needs to be a dynamic, sort of flexible approach to the training and to the certification approaches as well. And I think that's very critical. And shifting from sort of employer roles to meeting the student needs, the short-term credentials have the potential to meet the needs, and as Harry said, to provide economic opportunity to workers that maybe they would not have had without the short-term credentials. So for Kyle, I'm wondering, how does your school, in an area that covers a wide geography and a wide sort of rural area, how do you work in an area that is so wide geographically to meet the needs of the workers in the community?
Right, and so we represent 5 counties in the northern part of Nevada, and they're very rural in some places. Carson City campus is the biggest, about 60,000 people in that city, and then the rest of it's extremely rural, but there's high schools, there's pockets of population that want to train for the jobs that they could commute to within a 30 or 40-minute run. And so what we're doing is we do quite a bit of online education. We're actually talking about doing an Auto 101 class online. Which sounds crazy because how can you change a tire online, right? But what we're trying to do is we're going to model it as the theory piece would be online through traditional Canvas or other learning management systems, but then it would actually technically be a hybrid where we'd have the labs, maybe 4 per semester, that are deployed in the multiple cities, Fallon, Carson City, Yerington, Fernley, the ones that serve our area, so that the students can go into the lab on a Saturday and do the 4 labs and then do the kind of the book work, so to speak, or the theory online. And we've been doing that quite a bit to be able to blend the instructional models. The other thing we're working on for spring is we are actually going to create a mobile classroom, which is going to be the equivalent of a giant trailer on a 5th-wheel truck that we fill with advanced manufacturing equipment. We drive it out, park it in the high school lot. We can do 2-week training. We don't want to leave it out there more than that. We want to move it around, so we can do some deployment that way where they can actually get the hands-on piece and we can bring the equipment to them. And as we're working through it right now, we're trying to garner some funds to pay for it, and working through some grant applications. And I'm already thinking we're going to need 3 or 4 of these. We're going to, other schools across the country have done that, and it's a way to reach the rural population and get it in there. And then doing quite a bit with interactive video as we can, to support that. That's one of the things that we're doing to reach out to those rural populations, because the jobs have come, and we need to get people into the mode of finishing our credential. That's the kind of the culture of our state, and I'll piggyback on what Harry said about the credentialing. We're training a lot of people for manufacturing jobs that may have a 4-part progression: level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. And to Christina's point, what's coming 5 years from now, level 1 and 2 are going to be automated. So if you're stuck down here, you're going to need to start learning about 3 and 4, and that's the stackable piece of it. Do the 1 and 2 now, get you into the workforce, come back and do some training, finish that certificate, come back and do some training, associate degree, they all stack in, and you're set, and you're kind of a little bit more recession-proof and able to advance in the career. And so we do all of that, and we're trying, again, to deploy it out in our rural area, which is tough because we can't build we have 3 campuses, and they're very. Enrollment trends are kind of like a roller coaster all the time, and we're trying to maintain it, but we're doing all those tactics just to get it to the population.
So certainly technology and education technology is playing an important opportunity in the rural areas, but Christina is in what the research world tries to say is the ideal place to do research is Dayton. It's sort of the epitome of sort of the average community in the nation. We all like to do research in Dayton. Can you talk about the role of online education, which is a major focus in your school?
Sure.
And your job.
Right, and at the outset I should say I'm biased because I've worked in the digital learning sphere for about 10 years, so I clearly believe in the power of online education to level the playing field for students. I think it's important to point out that students that enter my community college average an annual income of about $17,000 when they enter, and that's annual income, when they first enroll at Sinclair. And we also know that 1 year post-graduation with an associate's degree, their average annual earnings are $38,000 annually. So this is literally the difference between living in poverty and having a living, honorable wage for people in our community. The biggest issue behind that, though, is that we trend like most any other community college. It takes students about 5 years to finish an associate's degree. And so it's clear that if we just focus myopically on short-term credentials as the vehicle by which people will improve their lives, if we do not also focus on how that education is delivered for them and supported for them, we're probably going to run into the same issues, which is even 18 credit hours, 16 credit hours, they're going to start, they're going to stop, they're going to have difficulty finishing. So I think Kyle really started to touch on a lot of the innovative things that are going on in community colleges where we're looking at delivering that differently. And so for us, that's online education, which solves our students' place barrier. They can't always come to campus, but we want to push a little bit further and solve the time barrier as well, and we're doing that through competency-based education, so allowing flexible entry flexible start, flexible stop. The student can really package the education, how it works best for them, and move through materials and courses. As they master material, they can move on independent of what our academic calendar says they should be doing. So how that works out in practice, for instance, for employers, I'll use retail management as an example. A booming area for us is retail management. It's grocery chains, it's food stores, fast food places, clothing stores, and we have a lot of requests in the region to help our employers grow their own. So there are people that have been at those employers for 5-10 years and don't have any formative education beyond high school. And so we created a competency-based retail management certificate. It's about 18 hours. And the students really can start and stop and complete courses at a time that works for them. And one of the best examples we have of that is for our local retailers. We have some cohorts that come through, and they like to begin in August for their first start of the year, and they like to end before Thanksgiving because it gives them basically the entire holiday period off to focus on the craziness that happens around their work. So I think experimenting with models like that is really important to solving both the time and place barrier for students.
And turning to Heidi, sort of NOCTI is sort of in a lead in developing microcredentials and sort of more targeting. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing with microcredentials and how those can be valuable to the students.
We work quite a little bit in the manufacturing space, but one area that we also work with is with the American Culinary Federation, so hospitality and food industry. And we have a project going with them in the microcredential area. So learners, as you've all mentioned, have different barriers. And so if a learner can maybe have a microcredential in food prep or food safety, and that's all that they can obtain in that period of time, at least that gives them something that they can go to an employer with to get a foot in the door. And then as they receive training on the job, they could earn more microcredentials or even move on to the culinary certification offered through ACF. So
And
we're
are
having
those online? Are those using digital platforms as well, or?
They are. So the content would be online as well as the actual, questions for the certification test.
Okay, so there's lots of activity going on there, and sort of piecing together different credentials or stacking them or timing them and sequencing them. What do we know, Harry, about putting together credentials like that for career advancement, not just for the first job, but future jobs?
I like a lot of what we heard here, not just the fact that that institutions are creating a pathway where people can get more training than just for this narrow job, but also talking about the barriers and the flexibility, giving people more options. Because the truth is, and we do see this in the data, most people, whether they're in an explicit career pathway or not, most people who get a certificate stop. They stop at first base, and that might be because there's so many complications in their lives and family needs, and there's also a significant fraction of people that probably don't have the academic backgrounds. I mean, a lot of the jobs we've heard about today, retail and culinary, not included, a lot of them are more somewhat technical, and those credentials often require some ability to handle more technical material, math and science and things like that. And a lot of people aren't equipped for that. So it's great that the pathways exist. It's important to think about how to make those pathways more conducive to the lives of the people who need them. What other supports might help people come back and take the second step and the third step. I think we had that conversation about a year ago at a meeting about how to help more people. So those are really, it's great to hear the experimentation around this issue, the innovations around this issue. But right now it does seem that most people get to first base and don't move much beyond that.
So in the schools that are developing the credentials, there's certainly in any organization or any institution, there are challenges that have to be overcome or addressed in order for you to achieve what you're trying to develop. I wonder if Kyle and Christina can say something about either challenges that you had to face or overcome within your institutional system in terms of administration or anything else to make these credentials a reality? Because community colleges, just like any other big organization, have their own sense of culture that's happening.
I can go first.
Okay,
Sure.
Kyle.
So they always say community colleges are nimble, but it still probably takes a year to get curriculum through, one way or the other, and that's been a
That's
tricky-
fast.
And that's fast, but the economy and the business around us can shift quite a bit. So it's a built-in obstacle. It's a built-in culture. We're a lot faster than other institutions.
How do you address that?
Well, what we try to do is, usually it's not something new. When we started building advanced manufacturing, when the new economic development plan came out and attracted the major companies to the state under the former TAC grants, the federal funding, we started building the programs because we knew it was coming, and so we were already on a pathway and to develop some programs, and then we can modify existing curriculum into the custom packages for employers and skills certificates. One thing that I find interesting, and the reason, and from a policy standpoint or administration standpoint, we get funded, 20% of our state funding comes from credential awarding. So we have to award diplomas, degrees and certificates in order to get that 20%. So it's in our best interest to actually get students to complete a degree or certificate, as I'm sure it is with other states. What we found was as students finish, the 24 credits of a certificate, like the first base, like you were saying, Harry, and then they don't want to do the 6 credits. And guess what those 6 credits are? That's your gen ed, right?
Yeah.
And when I talk to employers, the 3 things they say, if I need employees that can show up to work on time, pass a drug test, and read and write. Now, they're already assuming the technical piece, right, that we already trained them. So some of that's embedded in our soft skills training, but most of them we want to keep them going. So the obstacle to get the student to complete is in our interest, and we think it's better for the student because then it becomes a stackable credential, which is why we created some skill certificates that are under 30 credits that is primarily content. Then they build in the gen ed, they're at the certificate, and then they move on. So we have a number of different things going on there, but it's all woven into getting students to complete and pushing it through our systems.
So, Christina, in terms of challenges that you had to face, were they similar kinds of timing and framing, course development, or funding, or other challenges that came up as you were developing the approach towards short-term training?
All of the above. No, I would agree that one of the biggest challenges is that even as we are considered agile as an institution, by design, curriculum development should be a thoughtful process. It shouldn't just be that we plug new and exciting things in without considering the broader framework of what students need from us. So I think that there is some merit in taking as much time as necessary to do it right. But I also do think that there are levers from the state perspective and the federal perspective that cause us to begin to move in that direction a little faster, and performance-based funding is certainly one of them. If we're going to focus on completion, we need to constantly reconfigure and help our curriculum evolve. So yeah, I would say internally, it's very difficult to lift up and change the way that you deliver education. I would say this with particular regard to online blended models, competency-based models. There's going to be the usual change resistance that occurs when you are attempting to do something differently, and it takes time, and it's something that has to be worked through.
And every time you start something new in an organization, it is necessary to sort of begin to think about capturing the success and the progress that you're making. I'm wondering if, Heidi, you can say something about how NOCTI, how do you measure the success of your short-term credentialing and certifications, and do you have data that you use, or how do you know how well your credentials are working?
On our industry side, NOCTI has an education and an industry side. So on the industry side really is probably where this is very relevant. And a lot of times that would be working with our partners, and they in turn are working with the employers. So we get a lot of feedback from them on this is what we're hearing that our employers need. Here's a credential that we need to build. Here's how many employees that they're anticipating are going to be needed in their pipeline in the next several years. And so the feedback we receive from them really helps to drive how we work with them to develop a credential. On the education side, it's definitely a little bit different, certainly at the secondary level. At the post-secondary level, it is similar a little bit in The example that I had talked about with the state of Washington, where the employer is coming to the community college and the organization that we work with saying, you know, I need this many employees in the next 2 years, and really working with all of the organizations involved, including the industry, to determine, okay, well, what are those competencies looking like? You know, what exactly do you need to have measured so that you can be confident that what the community college is putting together for you is actually going to be what you need when these learners come through the program and are credentialed. So really it's a lot of, we have our own data, of course, but a lot of information gathering, I guess, and a lot of conversations. And, you know, snacks, breakfast, lunch, our partners aren't real fussy, but food, yes, agreed.
Harry?
So, Democrats pointed to a question about what the research says about this set of issues. So there is a research effort out there to try to connect administrative data at the educational level with earnings data, often quarterly unemployment insurance earnings data. And that enables you to see which of these credentials have more value and which have less value. And again, also what researchers are often more interested in, not just what has upfront short-term value, but maybe down the road over a 5-year period, over a 10-year period. You know, and I think, you know, as we said before, the employer perspective is very important, but there's a lot of employers, especially the smaller ones. You know, larger employers have a little more perspective on a range of skills that these workers might need to be able to advance in the organization or to fit a wider skill set. But, you know, small or medium-sized employers often have, I need this skill right now, and I need them to do this task. So they would prefer not for credit, because it avoids a lot of the bureaucratic issues of building curriculum, things like that, and they prefer very task-specific. But that's not necessarily in the best interest of the worker who, again, might not be working for that employer in 5 years or 10 years. So the data do give us a sense of what has long-term value, what has short-term value. And there's one other thing, and Christina, I think you mentioned performance-based funding, which a lot of states are moving in that direction. And the states are all over the map in terms of what they are rewarding in terms of, you know, getting more dollars there. I would like to see actually more emphasis on the subsequent earnings of the workers, not just completion per se. I would like to see the value of the, you know, over a longer term, what institutions get rewarded for. And of course, it's difficult to do this right, because you don't want to, you know, if you reward institutions for X, they will do X. However, you know, they might lower the bar. You know, there's a lot of ways to get to X to get that reward. So you have, you know, these systems can be gamed by employers, and you want to avoid that. But I think putting more emphasis on the earnings, you know, because the other thing is community colleges wear a lot of different hats, and we expect them with very limited resources to wear a lot of different hats, and there's often tension between the more academic, preparing people for 4-year, as opposed to the sort of more workforce side. And so the institutions may need more resources, as well as stronger incentives to pay significant attention to the kinds of issues we're talking about.
Thank you. So you may notice, just to spell Demetra, she's having a bit of a cough. So I think that just ending on what you said about, you're talking about what institutions need, and I think that's really important. We're talking about short-term credentials, but there's a broad set of demands and different types of audiences that community colleges are trying to serve. So what about the role of what policy can do at the state and federal level? I mean, how can policies and state and federal actions support what the goals that you all are trying to do? And let's start with Christina. And I know that some things that the state of Ohio has done has been supportive of what you're trying to do.
Sure, I think there are two distinct examples that I can think of where Ohio has pushed, nudged, encouraged us to do things differently, to look at things differently, and also to evaluate their own policy approaches. The first is very recently the state passed funding for something called Tech Cred. So we've known for years and years that the technology skills gap in Ohio is a problem, and getting graduates out fast enough to serve in those roles is also a problem. So the state recently decided to kind of flip the model, and they're going to offer a pool of funding employers must apply for, not schools. So the employers come forward, They ask for a certain amount of dollars related to educating their students, and essentially the state will reimburse them for the cost of that education. So employers move forward by applying, selecting educational partners, and then it kind of forces the conversations to occur a little bit differently between our community college and the employer about how we're going to educate those students. So I think that's one good example. Another is in 2017, the state of Ohio also decided that it was very interested in the activities around competency-based education, but the state wasn't really sure, the governor's office wasn't really sure what could be best done to support institutions in that effort. So they convened a state steering committee, and initially we had 19 of our 37 public colleges and universities participating. We had 2 institutions, Sinclair was one of them, engaging in some form of competency-based education. They formed this group and did a needs assessment and said, what could the state do in terms of policy to help you move forward in this? How could we technically support the activities around competency-based education? And it's been successful. As of this year, the committee now has 25 of 37 institutions participating, and we have 9 colleges and universities that are engaging in some form of competency-based education. So I think there's policy, and then there's also incentivization and nudges.
And Kyle, I know you talked a little bit about the economic development at the state and that role of how that connected to you. I don't know if you want to say more about that or other policy areas that are important.
Yeah, it's very, very similar to what Christina just spoke about, the policy and then the funding that comes with it and the funds that we're able to go after. We have a pool of funds through the Governor's Office of Economic Development that colleges can go and apply for, almost grant funded, that we have to have employers support, and they have to come to the table and say that the funds are being used appropriately in the sector. So it's not the employers, but the colleges can do it, but with the support of the employers. We've looked at ways to fund a career and technical education as we traditionally speak of it. And again, it comes back to funding in our state because we're rebuilding the workforce or diversifying the workforce really, and putting additional funds into our funding formula for higher ed that target the sectors that are in the state economic development plan is something that we've encouraged and has actually been passed to where, like a welding class will drive the formula at 4 times an English class, because the idea being that there's fewer students in it, cost of equipment, but we can keep it afloat without having to worry about how we're going to, put high numbers of students through when you can really only have 16 or maybe sometimes 12 in a class. And so they've worked on really a lot on the funding side to kind of really help build that workforce. And part of those economic development funds were a commitment by the state to train the workforce. And then we do go after grants, the federal apprenticeship grants, where we can train incumbent workers and that sort of thing.
So changing a tiny bit, I would ask Heidi, there's a lot of discussion around credentialing and certification of the state role in that, and maybe over certification, that because people don't have the flexibility to move from state to state to use similar credentials. Mm-hmm. How does your work with like employer associations and associations that are cross-state, how does that connect with what governments are doing in terms of certifications and licensing? Is there some discussion of that, or maybe just about the flexibility to bring certifications, all across the country, be able to?
Every state obviously has a different approach, and so when we're talking on the education side, we really have to work with our national association partners to try and figure out, what's going to work across the entire country versus something that's very regionalized. On the industry side of our company, things do become much more regionalized. So, construction in Michigan is very different than construction in Florida, and so if we're working with a national organization on a certification, what are the core competencies that could work across the entire nation, and do we need to consider taking more of a regionalized approach also, so that we can make sure that the employers in a particular region that may be very specific are having those competencies measured that they need as they're looking to hire employees coming out of programs.
That's interesting. It's complicated world. So Harry, I've asked a question of you about policy. We know, for one thing, that there's discussion about funding for short-term credentials, including at the Pell Grant and how that might work. What do you think about ways federal or state policy can help the development and support the community colleges?
So I think we want to think separately about how to help students, how to fund students, especially low-income students who might want to get these credentials, versus either the institution providing it or the employer. and who's going to pay how much. I think the way economists often think about this is that the more specific, the more customized the training is to the needs of any specific employer, employers ought to pay more for it in that case because it has less portability, for instance, to other, and the state shouldn't have to pay too much for something that's very specific. Of course, employers are often very nervous about that, and they think, well, why should we invest a lot? This employee might leave tomorrow, to go to another employer, for instance, and say. So there's some tension around that, and getting the right mix, I think, often depends on what kind of training we're talking about. And as I said before, the institutions are often so pressed for resources and so many competing demands. We've asked them to, and the students have a lot of need. So it's about what resources do the institutions need, and the institutions also have to provide some of the services that the students might need, support services, whether it's money for transportation, childcare, things like that, tutoring for things they don't. So I think states and the federal government should think about those other institutional needs, meeting some of them. And guidance, I think, is very, very important in this whole discussion. And especially, again, it's different for adults coming back who have some sense of what they're looking for versus an 18-year-old, 19-year-old coming pretty fresh out of high school. Now, surveys show 85% of the young people coming out of high school think they're going to get BAs. In reality, maybe 15% of them actually get the BAs. So they often need to be guided about what other options are there, some of which might equip them for the labor market much better than some of the liberal artsy kinds of things that have long-term but not short-term value. So there's a role for policy there, I think, to help institutions. And I think not just state dollars, federal dollars. I have said that there should be some amendments in the Higher Education Act to help the institutions provide more of this guidance that students need to make more sensible choices into what some people call guided pathways. But then getting to the student himself or herself, there is a discussion in Title IV of the Higher Ed Act to get a Pell Grant, for instance. There are minimum requirements for it has to be 4 academic credit, minimum numbers of hours, and there's conversation about. I'm a little reluctant to eliminate the 4 credit bar because then who knows, all kinds of folks will feed at that trough, all kinds of institutions that don't necessarily have good track records. But there is a vigorous discussion about lowering the numbers of required hours. And there's a bill by Senator Portman from Ohio and Senator Kane from Virginia called the Jobs Bill, which has proposed lowering, not eliminating the 4 credit requirement, but lowering the minimum numbers of hours to make Pell dollars and Title IV federal dollars more available to students that need exactly this kind of work.
Do you have comments on that? What do you think about that?
I agree. It's spot on with the assessment. I just wanted to note that we do have, much like JPMorgan is helped out in our state as well, but we do have a number of private donors who have come forward and said, we have scholarship funds, but they have to be for something that's going to get somebody a job right at the end. So they have to have a credential. They have to be going for a degree, much like the federal financial aid requires a degree declaration. But these are private people who have come forward and said, I'm going to give something for job training to help out the local economy. We see quite a bit of that.
So that brings up another question about, because you're bringing in another partner, right, the foundation funders, and you mentioned seeking grants for your mobile units and all. What are some roles of other partners and institutions? We talked about employers and your institutions, but what are the other partnerships that you think are really critical to this work? And do like NACD is one of those possible institutional partners. What are some of the partners that you think of? Like, are high schools part of this? Is that a role? What are the roles of foundations, local, other kinds of giving? I don't know.
So we have a very heavy dual enrollment program now with the high schools. We have a Jump Start program, which is 15 credits. Students are taking 15 credits and graduate high school with so most of them with an associate degree. And then we have dual credit, which is they can take classes here or there, based on interest. Because what we found, and I think it's pretty common throughout the country, is a lot of the career and technical programs that are now feeding the economy have been scaled back in the school districts. So this is a way we can build partnerships with our local school districts where they don't have to invest in the equipment. They can do it as dual credit or just send students over after school or those kind of models, or we can take our mobile classroom to them, especially in the rural areas, and help provide the training that then maybe fits some career and tech ed dual opportunity, or maybe they're just taking college classes after school. That's a big partnership. We have quite a bit of our enrollment, probably 15% of our enrollment is in high school populations right now. And then the other piece, having worked in fundraising for a number of years and 2 or 3 jobs ago, the private partners are very helpful to us for both scholarships, equipment, and even at times buildings. And they're usually out there and you don't know it unless you ask. And that's the thing. The biggest thing a donor has said is, how come you didn't give anything before? Well, nobody ever asked me. And fundraising is it's a tough place to be doing the ask, but you find people that are really interested in supporting education, supporting pathways will come to you and they'll say, like I stated earlier, this is for scholarships. This is not for anything else, not for discretionary funds. This is for scholarships, or this is for your lab, or I'm going to buy you this piece of equipment. They're very directive on it. But if you can have those conversations, you can usually fill quite a bit of your needs with that.
So I think that this is the challenge when you're a community college, everyone is your partner. So balancing the needs of all of these diverse groups that we've talked about today, we must have mentioned 15 of them here on this stage, from state partners to federal partners. Your accreditor is a partner, your various programmatic accreditors are your partners. There are all these different sources of input that we receive on how we should conduct ourselves as an institution, how best to serve students. And so I think at the end of the day, it really is about balance. We understand that broadly. We serve our community through preparing people for job-based programs and careers, and we also serve our community through preparing students for university. And you do the best you can to take in all of those sources of input and remember where your mission is at.
So we're going to move to Q&A in a few minutes, but I'd just like to kind of close and give everyone an opportunity here to say, you know, we have an audience, we have a web-based audience. A lot of community colleges watch our webcasts of these events, and a lot of people involved and their partners, their stakeholders, trying to figure out how to do some of the things that you all are talking about doing. So if you had to say what's one lesson or the most important lesson or some kind of something from your experience that you think is important for people to replicate or think hard about in development of short-term credentials, what would you say? And I know that, Heidi, you're not in the community college, but you have a lot of connections with all of the players. So I'd like to start with you and see what would a lesson you give to someone in that community college space about developing these credentials and what they should, you know, a lesson you've learned.
I think one of the things that we've been working through for a while now, and I imagine that's going to continue, is trying to anticipate where this whole credentialing world is going and what determines a quality credential and what does the employer need versus what the student needs, and just trying to find that balance, and also trying to work through from the perspective of the credentialing organization that's helping partners to develop these credentials, guiding them to say, you know, let's make sure that we're doing our due diligence to make sure that the path that we're going down is really what the learner or the industry is going to need, rather than just kind of, you know, taking a stab at it and hoping that it works. And also, I think, too, being able to really keep a pulse on the changes nationally, for us at least, so that we're able to pivot and, you know, kind of not go away from, but add to our traditional model of here's a comprehensive credential, and that's very, very good still, but also what else do we need? They need to be shorter, more nimble, mobile, faster, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, great. Kyle?
So that's a long answer, but I'll try to do it in one bullet point. Yeah, there's a lot of times we don't know what employers need, employers don't know what employers need, and students don't know where to go. And so bringing everybody to the table and talking about it, much like Heidi said, you know, and getting the information, putting it all in a mix and seeing and making sure it comes out right is what we need to be doing. And you know, you can do that through honest conversations. And one of the things I tell employers, which is extremely valuable, is that if you ever hear anything that we're not doing right, please, you will not hurt my feelings, bring it forward, because we want to make adjustments to our curriculum to meet the need. And students with the certificate will help you earn large larger wages over your course of your work time, but it will also help you against any downturn in the economies, because people with degrees tend to outlast the recessions rather than people who don't have credentials. And so putting everything together and really talking about it and making sure the mix is good and we get a good product and keep it going is what we try to do every day.
Christina, do you want to give a lesson for our listeners and people?
Sure. I think that for me, the single biggest takeaway is ensuring that the focus isn't just on this one thing as the vehicle or mechanism. There's a lot of focus around short-term certificates right now. And so not to develop an extremely narrow focus on this is going to be the thing that we do that is going to change completion for all students, but rather what is the messaging behind the short-term credential? It is that our constituents, our state, our community, our employers want more meaningful credentials of relevance. They want them faster. And we need to take that messaging in and then deliver on those promises more broadly, making sure that students are prepared with a hard skill, but can also walk into that place of employment with some of the soft skills that they need, that they can build on that credential and go somewhere else. So I think it's remembering just to diversify the focus, not just on the credential itself, but what it means to communities around us and our employers and students.
So I think that's really interesting and so great. I mean, I think many things you've all said across this panel have emphasized the connection of short-term credentials with other parts of what community colleges are doing and workforce system in terms of really making economic mobility for individuals, that it's not just one and done, let's pump them out. Harry, do you have a suggestion or a lesson? Because your statement, the research showing that people don't, suggests that we still have it's great to have this mindset, we still have a way to go maybe.
Yeah, I think there's two things that we want to encourage, certainly at the state level and maybe at the federal level as well. So first of all, there are these model programs that have been rigorously evaluated, and we know their names, Project Quest and Perscolis and some others. Every state, when I get together with state workforce folks, people brag about we have 50 industry partnerships. Well, we have 100 industry partnerships. The question is, how good are any of the partnerships and how broad? So I think there's this effort to take those model programs and figure out how do we capture the best aspects of them in these replications and expansions at the state level, knowing that the circumstances might also be different as we're looking at different states or different industries or different populations. And there's an organization called the National Fund for Workforce Solutions that tries to do this work, tries to go to a state or a region, a community college that doesn't have these kinds of sector-based programs and tries to build them from the ground. And I think they are a good resource. But this question of, okay, what pieces do we need to have to give us a chance at having the kind of success that some of these model programs have? The other thing is just a broad pitch for data and research. You're shocked. That's always, every economist, every academic ends up, but you know, these are hard questions of what really has value, what has value today versus tomorrow, what are the broader needs that students might have, not just for particular employers' need. Data help us answer those questions. Getting data, education data from the institutions, linking them with earnings data, hopefully over a longer time, maybe from quarterly unemployment insurance records, trying to bring in, if we can, some of the non-academic credentials. You know, Steve Crawford and others have thought about this broad range. How do we get industry recognized credentials in the mix? So whatever we can do in that whole range to really get a better sense what has value, which value lasts and which don't last, and for whom, I think that's always a good thing to try to invest in.
Great, wonderful. So now I'd like to open it up to our people here. We have someone with microphones coming around, and I think we have our first question over here. If you could just identify yourself and speak into the microphone so we can hear. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Lou Jacobson. I'm a researcher like Harry. So I thought this was a great discussion, but one thing I haven't heard is any support for the U.S. workforce system, the stuff the Department of Labor leads. And it would be very interesting getting reactions to it in a particular way, is that theoretically, the Department of Labor gives out money for training, and they have a whole series of procedures in which they counsel the clients, and they also collect data to see what the effects are. And if we had a nationwide uniform system, we actually do, but nobody seems to use it very much. So what the key point here is that Harry made is that Pell Grants are for credit-based programs and favor high-quality students. But the kind of students you're talking about who need a little bit of training to get a leg up aren't being covered. But the workforce system, if it had the authority to give out, had the money to give out grants to the kinds of workers you're treating, they could be the arbiter of whether these programs are worth it or not. So I don't know if I said too much, but I'd be interested in each of the panel members giving your reaction to the value of the DOL programs.
Does anyone want to take it?
I'll take a quick stab, and then I would like to hear from
You can think about
folks
your
more on the ground.
answer.
Yeah, I mean, so two things, Lou. Number one, the amount of money, the resources available within the WIOA system for training are so small that it only does very short-term training. And the whole ITA, individual training, it's a voucher. And so I think compared to many other industrial countries, and you're right, this would be a good place to fund not for credit credentials, maybe outside of a more stackable system. But the resources, I think, are so small. And the other problem, I think, is that even though they call each other partners, and sometimes they get together at meetings, and the truth is that there is a big disconnection between these two systems on the ground. The one-stop shops and evaluation evidence does say that the services at the one-stop shops, and especially the intensive services, are very valuable and very, very cost-effective. But again, the resources there are very small. But most people who go to a community college to get even a certificate don't ever set foot at a one-stop. And there's this disconnection. So building more bridges, co-locating more one-stop offices on community college campuses, I think, might be a way to get at that problem. But the limited resources for that whole system, as well as the disconnection, are the two biggest problems that I see in getting what you suggest needs to be done.
Do either of you have some connections with the public workforce system in the work that you're doing that you could speak to?
We do in Ohio, but it's mostly facilitated through the state. So we do have one-stop agencies, and we actually go out and have an office in those agencies. It's very underutilized, if I'm being honest, and I think it probably speaks to the disconnect that you're talking about. There are just layers of complexity between how we interact with our state and then the federal government. And when it's not clear, we'll default to what's known and what is easier for us to navigate.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that with a quick comment. There was a point in time a few years back, 2 years back, when anyone who wanted to train in any of the programs that would put them immediately to work, I could find funding for them for scholarships, and it was not through the local workforce agencies. We did get federal American Apprenticeship Initiative grants, which was good. That helped incumbent training, not necessarily incumbent training, but helped people get into it. And then we could bring people back with the private funds as incumbent workers or as first going back to getting their credentials so they can move into the workforce.
And I think it's a very interesting question. And like many things in the workforce system, it's so varied across the country and across, because we do have examples of workforce systems, public workforce systems working really closely with their community colleges. So it really varies. So there's a question over here, I see. Oh, and we'll come back to you, sorry. Making her walk a little bit there.
Sorry. I'm Sue Klein from the Feminist Majority Foundation. And my question is, we know that many of the occupations that you have your programs serve are sex segregated. And I was wondering if each of you could give an example of what you're doing to overcome the sex segregation in various occupations.
Thank you.
Well, I'll suggest something that might not go in the direction that you're expecting. What you often see, and many, if you look at community college data around the country, is that there are some industries and occupations that, in fact, that are thought of traditionally female. So the healthcare sector, I've looked at data from Kentucky very recently on this. There are strong earnings rewards to getting credentials, whether degrees or certificates in healthcare. In Kentucky, something like a third of women students at community colleges were in healthcare. Less than 1/10 of the men were, even though the data pretty clearly show that these are the strong rewards there. So I think it's important to get out the word, to get out what the data show on where earnings are strong. And I'm sure that, and there's many examples on the flip side. You see fewer women in a lot of the other technical areas, sort of applied STEM, more mechanical kinds of areas. But I think it's very important to get the word out about which of these programs offers good labor market rewards. By the way, we do so little in our high schools to teach students about what the job market is like that they're going to face, and what gets rewarded and what doesn't. But I think getting more of that data out there to students in high school, maybe even earlier, I think is very important because there's imbalances on both sides.
It goes to the issue of how students are choosing these credentials in these programs. But Heidi, you wanted to jump in?
We work with Toyota in Texas, and they in turn work with one of our certification partners. And they have a very big focus on making manufacturing accessible to women. And they've actually pushed that down. We were with them in a meeting last week and down to the 8th grade level. And they have a program called GEMS. It's Girls Exploring Manufacturing. And so they have a very corporate outlook that they want to get that message down into the junior high level, even to start engaging girls in learning that all the different things that manufacturing can be for them and trying to get them into that pipeline. And they take that all the way up to the worker level, and just really have a big focus on women in manufacturing. So that's been really fun to be a part of.
I think we had a question over.
Yes, hi. This is really interesting, and I'm really excited about the work all of you are doing. My question is around the actual content of the courses for the soft skills that individuals need to take advantage of the short-term credentials. I think Professor Holzer touched on it a little bit, meaning if you're an adult returning to the job market, taking one of the micro-credentials, or a teenager entering it, what are the soft skills that you all include to ensure that people are actually prepared to take advantage of the credential they have and do the best with, like, how they're prepared to really function?
I can give a pretty specific example. We embed within a lot of the technical degrees what we call human relations, and that's where you find the soft skills. And one thing, just an example, is with our heating, ventilation, air conditioning program. We, of course, across the spectrum work on communication and that sort of thing, but when somebody does a service call, and I hope this answers your question, when they do a service call and they knock on the door, they're supposed to actually move back a couple steps to not be coming on top of the customer, being too close to the customer when they open their house door. So we teach things like that you wouldn't even think of, that I didn't think of till I knew we were teaching it. And I said, wow, because that's one of those customer relation things that if a stranger's coming to the door, you don't want to approach too quickly. And then I'll toss it to Christina, because I'm sure there's more examples, but the reading, the writing, and being able to send a text message or an email that doesn't come across as rude or abrupt is beneficial.
So I would also say, generally speaking, in longer degree programs, it's easier because we can embed things like field experience where they start to have that. Now, how we solve for that in our shorter technical programs is that all of our programs and courses are required to roll up into not just technical competencies and skills, but general education outcomes. And those are defined at the institutional level and include things like problem solving, conflict resolution, working in teams. And those are then expected to be designed and embedded into the structure of the courses. So as you have lessons that suit sort of technical competencies, there has to be some display in interaction or dynamic for those general education outcomes, and they all have to be met in each course that's offered at St. Clair.
Did we have another? Oh, okay. I saw, so we have here, and then I'll make you come back over here, and then we'll have to end. Oh, I'm getting the signal for last question. So if you could make your question short, then we'll get all three and let people.
Well, I'm Maria Ferreira from the World Bank. So many countries in the world. So many countries in the world are very interested in these type of things, and they often ask us two questions. The first one is, what is the role of government regulation for these programs? When does the government come in and say, this is a high-quality credential, especially before the credential has been provided? In other words, before there are even outcomes to tell whether the credential is good or not. So how does government, the accrediting agency, or whomever regulate or tell or oversee the quality of these credentials? And secondly, how do we avoid the Wild West situation in which just about everybody offers a credential? Thank you.
And so let's just try and, if I could get your question too, and then we'll come here, and then we'll just let that be a kind of a wrap up to it.
So I like the last two questions on quality assurance and on standardization in this Wild West. They're both big ones, and you've touched upon it. I loved your example, Kyle, of having a list of competencies and asking, but of course the question is, what are the competencies on that list and how do they compare to the competencies at Western Governors University or some other place that they're being developed by the Chamber of Commerce these days? So there's this huge problem with defining what the skills are and getting granular and having some dictionary and having some comparability, and that would be important to portability of credentials. But all that said, and this has really been interesting for me, my question is, in addition to additional data of the kinds that Harry discussed on connecting administrative data and labor market outcomes, are there other kinds of research as you go about your jobs, designing programs, satisfying employer needs? What kinds of research, more broadly speaking, are needed to help us move forward to improve the quality, the portability, the standardization, the ability to serve students long-term and not just for the immediate next job with credentials? What sorts of research would you ask we're a think tank. Would you ask the research community to get busy on?
That's a question we love, and I'll just get this, so you can all be thinking of short answers. We only have 1 minute left here, so please make your question short.
Thank you. My name is Catherine Ross. I'm Director of Education at the Association for Manufacturing Technology, so an employer association. My last 10 years were spent in the development and proliferation of standards-based industry recognized credentials. And I understand that, or it's my feeling, that those third-party industry credentials are a sort of modern currency in a gig economy, in a modular educational workplace. So are you involved in or have you observed industry-recognized credentials being used as a basis for articulation? So if a high school student earns 2 or 3, is he getting credit towards community college? If he earns them in community college, is he getting credit towards university level, or is it recognized in the hiring process? Can it be applied to a competency-based or hybrid apprenticeship? That's it.
All right, so we have 3 kind of different questions, but related, I think. Does anyone want to take a stab? We had what is the government's role in regulating, figuring out what's high quality before we have outcomes? What are some research questions that might be interesting to answer? And
I'll give it a shot, but it's just a couple notes, and then we'll let the others jump in. So the industry-recognized credential, we start with the end in mind. The state develops our economic development plan, attracts industries, and we as a community college support those industries through training and the 4-year transfer pipeline. And so when we talk about the granular level of going down, those programs are already vetted through our accreditation process, our internal curriculum development process, but sometimes we'll take pieces of them, different classes, and repackage them, provided the framework is consistent top to bottom with Gen Ed and all the other requirements, and create a new degree that's specific to the employer. So that's one piece. To the high school question, we do articulate CTE college credit, so students do come in, and we always value, again, the end in mind. We teach, for example, Siemens Mechatronics. It's a short-term program to get them that credential, which is specific to that type of equipment. Students bring in credit from either our program or from the high school or experience. We put them in that, but they always go down that track to make sure everything's covered along the way to finish that credential. So,
does anyone else have some last words they want to jump in?
I'll say a couple of things quickly. Number one, to me, the evidence of quality is about worker earnings, not just in the short run, but over time. So to me, that's ultimately the test, the market test that these different programs, and especially if they want public support. It can't just be really short-term focused on the industry itself, in my view. But your question, there's always this tension. you can make an argument for government regulation by saying something is a public good and the public has an interest. Too much regulation and the private sector walks away. The sweet spot, the optimal spot, probably differs between one country and the next. European employers are a lot more comfortable with government mandates than others. So how any particular community defines that, but that's trying to find that balance between the benefits and the costs of the regulation, I think, is the challenge.
So I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there, but I really want to give a very big thank you to our panelists. And thank you so much for coming and for our web audience.